Kyle was at the prison early and soon picked up the prisoners that were going to the base. A shortage of vehicles meant he had to take the van and not a more comfortable bus. It was packed, and the 13 prisoners were shackled to their seats so tightly that movement was restricted even more than usual. Some of the prisoners were complaining about the cramped conditions. Others were too sick to object and merely stared blankly into space. The morning was cold but clear, and it was turning into a beautiful day in the desert. The van topped the hill and started down the long straightaway that crossed the valley leading to the base. There was no traffic on the road. Fairly unusual for a Friday morning, Kyle thought. Off in the distance, on the other side of the valley, a lone car approached. Just as Kyle lifted his gaze in that general direction, all hell broke loose. Kyle saw a blinding flash and then a fireball as the gas tank blew and lifted the car into the air in slow motion. 10 seconds later, the sound of the blast reached his van, engulfing it a second time in the horror they had just witnessed. The stricken car appeared to hit the ground in slow motion, but the force of the landing blew the tires and collapsed the wheels. The car hit the ground and bounced onto the driver's side and then slowly rolled onto its roof. The force of the landing snuffed out the fire, and by the time Kyle made it to the wreck, the horrific scene was quiet except for the sound of coolant boiling out of the radiator and one bent wheel slowly rotating. Kyle quickly secured his van and the occupants, grabbed a fire extinguisher from under the seat, and ran as fast as he could to the car. The strong smell of gasoline caused him to stop 30 or so feet away, fearing it would erupt in flames again at any second. He circled the wreck for the best view, trying to figure out what to do next. He could see a smoldering body lifeless on the desert floor halfway out of the car through the driver's window. Kyle recognized the vehicle's military markings as being from Randall. There was a briefcase on the ground about 20 feet from the car, and Kyle could see it had a medical insignia. Realizing the driver was dead and beyond all possible help, he went over and picked up the partially opened case and looked inside. Property of Dr. Mark Moran. "No!" Kyle shouted at the top of his lungs. "Mark!" Kyle stood there fully enveloped in the horror of the scene. He thought about calling 911 but knew from experience the cell signal in the valley would not be strong enough to complete the call. He would have to drive to the top of the next hill before he could report the incident. As he turned to run back to the van, a thunderous explosion enveloped the van in a huge, towering fireball. The shockwave threw him backwards to the ground and down a ravine. By the time Kyle was able to scramble back up the slope, the van was completely engulfed and burning furiously. He tried to use the extinguisher, but he couldn't get close enough for the foam to reach. He tried to throw sand on the fire, but couldn't throw enough to make any difference. He could see the van's paint blister and melt off. He heard the windshield pop and crack, then watched it melt, dripping in gobs onto the shoulder of the road. The tires roared with fire and thick black smoke. The prisoners didn't have a chance. Kyle dropped to his knees and sobbed as he watched the fire rage, its glow casting his shadow against the cool desert sand. Most of those prisoners were his friends. Some were even due to be released soon. A shudder gripped his body as he realized how close he'd come to becoming a casualty himself. Kyle dropped to all fours, vomiting at the thought of so much death. Had he not stopped to help Mark? His mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps, he thought, he was still a target. At that moment, he felt what all terrorists seek to instill: unreasonable, ungovernable fear. The kind Kyle's father, who had experienced the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Towers, had told him about. Fear that possessed him and clouded his ability to think. Just as on that clear September morning years ago in New York City, the realization hit him hard. One hit could be an accident, but 2 hits was no chance occurrence. 2 hits was murder, conspiracy, execution, an attack by an unseen enemy, and with our own predators, no less. And just like on September 11th, Kyle had no idea how big it got, where it stopped, who was next, or even where it was safe. Mark's words of caution replayed in his head. His greatest fears brought to life, and death.